Thanks for joining us. We really appreciate it. I'm really excited to celebrate Zach's book, Boy Oh Boy. I'm Brandi Wells. I was at the University of Alabama, did my MFA with Zach, and then we were in a PhD program at USC together. And he's my good friend and was my roommate. And then we have Kellie Wells.
Hi. I had the great pleasure of getting to work with Zach for the 4 years that he was in the MFA program at the University of Alabama, where I teach prose. And I also had the real honor of getting to watch him really produce his thesis.
And then we have Tasha.
Hi, I was at the University of Alabama with Zach. Also, I was in his cohort. So a big thing for me was that I was actually in the class with Zach. We were in a prose poem slash fiction class together when he started writing a lot of the pieces that are in this book. So I've seen it since its like nascent stages.
Awesome. And then we have Aimee.
Hi, I'm Aimee Bender, and I worked with Zach at the PhD program at USC and got to encounter his wonderful application and have him in a workshop and also work with him closely in an independent study, and just enjoyed working with him and his work so much.
Thank you. And I think we're going to start off with Aimee doing a reading from this book.
I think we're going to each read Boy Oh Boy is like made to be read aloud in a lot of ways. It's such that sounded, is that hang on? No, that beep wasn't me. Okay. It really it feels to me like having different people read segments from this book is exactly a wonderful way to celebrate it, because it's so pleasing to the ear. So this is a story from Boy Oh Boy called Embodied, and this is the complete story. Your boyfriend is leasing space inside your body. The rent you charge is reasonable, a steal really. But since you're in a relationship, you decide you're not going to push it by asking for what living space in your veins and between your organs is really worth. Your boyfriend comes and goes as he pleases through a slit in your back, parallel to your spine. Sometimes during the day, you feel a kind of heat on the inside of your skin, and you know that he's sitting or lying there right inside your body, and you touch or stroke the spot to let him know you know he's there. He's very considerate, keeps the volume down on his television, makes sure everything is clean and well maintained. You've been breathing a little bit better lately, your heartbeat less erratic, and you know your boyfriend has been lovingly scrubbing your lungs and arteries, polishing each surface clean and gleaming like he has removed decades of soot from a dirty window. When you ask him to meet you for dates, he emerges from the slit parallel to your spine, and he is covered in your blood and the other viscous fluids of your body. His hair is matted to his head, and his hand is too slippery to hold. He shivers a little bit when he's with you, like being outside your body brings on a chill, and you take pride in this evidence of the heat of your viscera. When your boyfriend starts to cancel dates with you or doesn't show up when you've made plans, you are worried. Any number of things might have happened, like he has found someone else, or he is taken ill, or he fell down the tub. You know from the warmth and pressure building along your tibia that he is still inside you. When you call him on the phone to ask why you haven't seen him very much lately, he says that he sees you all the time. In fact, he says he sees the parts of you that you can't see. And from the inside, with the light shining through your skin, your body is a cathedral. You don't have much to say to that. You find a needle and thread and sew yourself shut.
Thank you. Can you tell us what made you choose that one?
Well, I mean, it really is hard to pick. But I think there's something about the physical language of the body that I love, the vocabulary in there of the physical body, the kind of to have this feeling of someone inside one's body, but written by a man about another man, though it feels so pregnant-like, and also it's also sort of sensual and sexual, but also not, because there's sort of this merging of bodies. And I think all of that feels really evocative to me and really compelling. And all his stories have an incredible rhythm. So they're just such a pleasure. So I think all of them really deliver in that way. And this also just being one. And I like the ending too. I like that the ending, especially the moment of the cathedral, the moment of someone seeing all the parts of you that you feel like you can't even see. It's unbearable. You gotta, can't ever speak to that person again. I like that.
I love what you said about them being so well lent to being read aloud. When I was trying to pick what story I would read, I found myself wanting to excerpt from 30 different stories and just read 2 sentences from each, because there are all these little moments. When the experience when you're reading aloud and you want to turn to a friend and be like, listen to this part, or let me read you this one line. The whole book is that feeling, right?
Yeah, it really is.
Absolutely.
So I know that Aimee just read, but Tasha, I really wanted to ask you, before we leapt into things, a little more about the inception of the book when Zach first started writing it. Because I know one thing about Zach is that he hated second person. He hated it so much. And so it's so amazing that he ended up writing this whole book in second person. Can you talk a little about the beginning of that project, or when he was working on it?
So I've been trying to think about that class, and it was 5 years ago now, so it's been quite a long time. And so I was trying to think about what I remembered from that time. And both Zach and I, it was one of the last classes that we took. And so we had been in the program longer than a lot of other people. I think we felt really confident. And I think for Zach, that was a moment when he really came into his own voice. I think before that, he was trying to figure out who he was as a writer. And then he started writing these, and it was something really clicked. And I think the weird thing about workshopping second person is there's always those questions, right? Why is this in second person? What is this doing? It gets questioned in a way that first or third does not. But I think there was sort of a consensus that it was working really well in these stories.
I agree.
And isn't it sort of this unique second person, because there's the you, but your boyfriend is so central throughout. So it's a very, usually second person is that central you. And so it could sort of encompass, but this second person has a very specific name, but even though the boyfriend keeps changing in as many different entities, I think that also feels very fresh, like a new way to make a second person his own.
Yeah, and I think that the you feels both specific and general. Yeah. I'm the you is a gay man who has a boyfriend. But the you, I think, also applies to the reader, and it feels like it's encompassing both of those things at the same time, even while many of the things that happen in the book are really fantastic and not things that any you has really experienced.
Yeah, I agree with that. Kellie, can you talk a little about sort of the process of him writing and revising this? Because I know it was his thesis project.
Yeah, it was. I was going to say, one of the things that that might be interesting to know is that originally Zach wanted to work on a novel, or he wanted to. There were a couple of other possible projects that he wanted to work on for his thesis, and he wasn't getting them to propel in the way that he wanted them to. And so one day he sent me a couple. He said, "Well, I've got these second person stories that I'm writing, and I don't know if I really want to, make a book out of them, but there's something I can do." And so he sent them to me, and I thought that they were extraordinary. And I was like, yeah, you absolutely keep doing this. And he was kind of hesitant, and he did something that I see lots of writers do sometimes, which is that he discounted the thing that came to him most readily, most easily. And, I thought that they were remarkable, and I couldn't imagine writing them myself. I couldn't imagine anybody else writing them. They were just so utterly, thoroughly Zach. And so beautiful. And they seem to leap from his skull like fully formed too. That was another remarkable thing to watch. Like he was such an extraordinary, he was very craft precise. And he wouldn't, maybe it was the poet in him, but I think he wouldn't move forward until he had sort of in these stories, until he kind of sculpted something exactly the way he wanted to. And so when I got them, I mean, they were just these glittering, perfect objects. And that made him sort of dubious about them. He was like, well, sure, I could write a whole book of these, and I was like, oh, you should totally do it. And then he was publishing them before, maybe when he was in that class with you, Tasha, before I even started to look at them. So, he was getting a lot of positive feedback, and I think that too made him a little suspicious about their merit. But eventually, obviously, he went into it with both feet, and now we have this extraordinary book.
Yeah, awesome. Tasha, do you want to go ahead and read an excerpt now?
Yeah, so I decided to read the first story in the collection, which is called Trolling. When you keep finding troll dolls around your apartment, you assume your boyfriend is playing a practical joke. You think your boyfriend is funny, like that time he asked you for $10 and then didn't contact you for 6 months after you gave it to him. The first troll has blue hair and a jewel in its belly and sits on top of your alarm clock. The second you find floating face down in your toilet tank, its wet purple hair radiates from its head like a nerve. You don't mention the trolls to your boyfriend. You pay for dinner and he talks about his job. This is part of the joke, you think, and you know the joke can go on for up to 6 months. When you open your bedroom door and the room is so full of troll dolls that they avalanche into the hallway, this is part of the joke. The joke is when you find, well, it must be 500,000 troll dolls buried neck deep in your front lawn. Your first instinct is to call someone, but who? A gardener? A toy store? The last straw is when there are no troll dolls at all for a week and then longer, a month or two. You and your boyfriend start getting into fights. You don't bring up the troll dolls, but you yell about other things. About the time he left the butter out overnight. Your boyfriend yells back that you don't actually need to refrigerate butter. It will be fine. You're pretty sure that you read that somewhere, but you aren't willing to give any ground now. 6 months later, he calls. No reason, just wants to talk. You're pretty sure he wants something, but it feels good to hear him laugh. You open the junk drawer, but you don't remember what you were looking for when he called. He's talking about getting a new job. You find the first troll, blue hair with the belly jewel. What was the deal with the troll dolls anyway? You ask, cutting him off. I have no idea what you're talking about, he says. And now he's lost his place and has to start his story over.
Thank you. I love that one. Can you talk a little about why you chose that one?
Yeah. So I was looking through the book and I was like, what do I want to read? And so I wanted to read a whole story because I think that excerpts of them work really well because they are very lyrical. But it felt better to me to read something complete. And a lot of them are like, I timed myself reading that earlier and it was like 2 minutes. So a lot of them are really fast. But also yesterday I was reading a book about internet trolls And I think the concept of trolling, like, applied to this book is really interesting, because that's essentially a lot of what the boyfriends are doing, right? Like, the boyfriend is trolling the narrator, and sometimes I think the narrator is trolling the reader, and it's sort of like balancing this line between being something really serious and also being something that's like in jest, and you never know whether you're supposed to laugh or you're supposed to like go into like some of the emotionality of the book.
Yeah, I think this book has so much to do with humor, and I think so much of the humor is really sad, which I think is where humor really works, right? Like, where you get that juxtaposition of like sadness and humor, and then sometimes violence, right? We have that spy versus spy story where the boyfriends keep one-upping each other, which this story sort of reminds me of a little. But I wanted to ask you, I'm trying to think of how to word this, a little about, if you could talk a little about how humor works in the book. And like,
yeah,
that sense of humor is so specific.
I think that the humor, again, a lot of it feels like someone being self-deprecating on the internet. Like, they're like, ha ha, my boyfriend's so terrible, but also I love him. And so a lot of it like revolves around that idea. They're like, my boyfriend is kind of terrible to me, but I'm going to be in this and I'm going to be devoted to him no matter what. So a lot of it's like about the idea of love and how you love through different struggles and how you get loved in return.
Yeah, I love that you chose to read the first story too, because I thought a lot about how Zach put this book in order, because I watched him print out all the pages and shuffle it and think about what to include. I know that thing at the end, the village with all the boyfriends, which is really different than the rest of the stories. He like waffled over whether or not to even include that. And the penultimate story, which is the one right before it, the boyfriend singularity, he wrote that pretty, like, I feel like the book was finished when he wrote that. Like, that's like a really recent story. So like, to read that story is to see Zach thinking about the whole book, right? Which is so interesting. Because reading the book now is so much a way to still be with them, right? You have these little moments where you're like, I think this happens in fiction all the time, where an author starts to like reveal themselves. Like, there's some truth in it, even if it's absurd and fantastic. So I think a lot about the book is that, like, it's a way to keep dwelling with Zach even when he's not here.
And I think oh, go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to say that that I think I feel Zach's presence most palpably in the humor, because it always has as you were saying, it has sadness, and it also often has teeth. You know, the humor is barbed in some way, and that always makes me laugh and makes me think of Zach, and I think about him in my class. You know, he had a great classroom presence where, you know, he was so quick, which I think you can pick that up from these stories, but he was just so quick-witted. He was so sharp that you had to really be on your toes, because you know, it was going to get mirrored back to you in some comic and possibly sharp way. So, but I you know, I loved that about him, and I love it when I see that, when I feel that in the book.
Just gonna ask Brandi, because it feels like such a good ending of the book to have that story. Like, do you know how that decision process? Can you say a little bit more about what led him to decide? Because not only does he put it last, but it's its own little section, right? So it's like he really ended up highlighting it in, I think, a lovely way.
Yeah, he really waffled about it. He was like, do I not include it? Do I put it in another section? Do I put it by itself? And he agonized over it the same way that I feel like he agonized over sentences, right? Like, I feel like everything had to be precise. So like, ordering the book felt like it took forever, right? And he was really dour, grim about it. It's never going to happen, never going to finish. And of course he did, right? Like, and it was the right choice. I don't know what finally convinced him. I think I urged him. I was like, please put it last. And I know BWR has like an online component now that's the Boyfriend Village that's named after that story, which is really nice. It's a nice thing for them to do.
Did he talk to you, Brandi, about the place of the longer stories in the collection? Because there, when the version of it that I saw, I think there was only one longish story, which was the Bloodmouth story, and the rest of them were all really pretty short. But they're quite, there are several much longer stories in the collection now.
It was, he had like a really precise method, and I wish I remember it, of like not only where lines could end on the page and where paragraphs could hit on the page, and like the order and the average of like where long and short stories went. Like, he was very calculated about it, to like beyond anything that I could even like grapple with. I was like, oh man, like I don't know what to do with that. But he knew exactly how he wanted it to be and set about to do it.
That's so interesting that you pointed out. If you like look at the book, like on the page, trying to center myself, they're like the exact same length, the two different stories. I did not notice that before.
Well, and you can see like that same sort of rhythm and precision that we're talking about. And the individual story is like fractal-like in the book as a whole, that you can really see that sort of care of structure and form. And it makes it so pleasing,
Yeah, I think it's definitely there.
Right, like they really do work together as a whole book because of that, I think, organization that he did, and that sort of that sharpness, Kellie, that you're talking about, applied, writ large a little bit.
Kellie, do you want to go ahead and read your excerpt?
Sure. Yes.
Thank you.
I'm going to read a story called Esquire.
This is one of my favorites.
Yeah, mine too. It is something that you notice very suddenly. You are standing in the checkout line holding a sack of limes, and you realize that the cashier is your boyfriend. He wears a wig that is long and chestnut colored and has a slight weave to it. This hair is nothing like your boyfriend's hair. It could be your imagination, but it seems your boyfriend, wearing a bald cap, is also bagging your groceries, making a face at your unripe bananas. It's possible that you are just having a bad afternoon, except all week you don't run into anyone who isn't your boyfriend. Your boyfriend in dreadlocks hands you your cup of coffee. Your boyfriend in an undershirt jogs through the park, while your boyfriend in an extremely fancy car cuts you off in traffic. You go to the gym, and your boyfriend sits at the front desk when you check in. Your boyfriend hands you a towel. Your boyfriend has already worked up a sweat by the time you make it to the weight room. You are at a club late one night, and you have unprotected sex in the bathroom with your boyfriend, who is on his break from dancing on a glowing platform. You go to your therapist, who is also your boyfriend, and you feel uncomfortable telling him about your feelings. Let's say I am your boyfriend says, being your therapist, with glasses and unflattering lipstick. What is it you feel like you couldn't tell me? In your hands, you hold a magazine that you carried with you from the waiting room. You couldn't put it down. You twist it nervously, bending the pages into a semi-permanent tube. Your boyfriend is on the cover, wearing a well-tailored suit and grinning, and suddenly you can feel him looking at you from every direction. You look over at a lamp, and it is your boyfriend, and the computer, your boyfriend. Your therapist's chair is your boyfriend, and the chair you are sitting on is your boyfriend, and the bookcase is your boyfriend, and the desk and the diploma on the wall is your boyfriend. The whole room is your boyfriend, and the sky outside, the trees, the cars, the roads, the buildings, the earth, everything is your boyfriend, and you love it. You love it all so goddamn much.
Thank you. I love that ending. Can you tell us a little about why you picked this story?
Yes. So this story does something that a lot of the stories do, and it just does it so perfectly, which is it completely explodes its conceit. And that is one of the things that I admired so much about Zach, is that he had no timidity about whatever fabulist or surreal or strange premise he was plying, he went all the way in. But then the amazing thing is that he would explode his conceits, and then he would come back. He would, in this story, he sort of explodes the conceit, and then he slows it down with the therapist, right? And so we spend a little time with the therapist, and then he goes back out a second time at the very end, and it's this incredible virtuosity. I mean, really, there isn't any other writer I can think. I mean, there are plenty of writers who write in a big, capacious way, but just not exactly like this. He just does it so expertly, and I admire it so much. And it's and rhythmically, as we were talking about the rhythm, it's rhythmically just so perfectly rendered. Such a pleasure to read aloud.
Yeah, I love how a lot of the conceits for the stories are in the first sentence, the first couple of sentences, and it doesn't get boring. Like, it's so wild, and he does just follow it through. And then you could easily read some of these as allegory, but like, he's like, no, like, this is literal, like, this is happening.
Yeah.
And like, I think you could do both, right? But like, I always really enjoy fiction that like lets its strangeness and weirdness be literal. You can buy in and believe it, which is always what I want to do. If you present me with something fantastical or like sci-fi-ish, like, I'm just going to believe it's true until you tell me it's not.
Right.
And I think that's one of the things that's so enjoyable about this book.
It's so funny. It's just so funny when the therapist is like, pretend I'm your boyfriend. But like, it's just so wonderful. It's such a wonderful twist. And then, yeah. And I think it's interesting because the ending is so beautiful with the love and the sort of expanding love. But I think there's also one of the things when I read and hear the story is it can be read, I think, as such a way to think about loss. Because I think there's also that feeling when you see, if there's we don't know I guess at the ending, we know that there's love and there's that space for it, but there's also the feeling of seeing someone all around the world that maybe there's the loss connected to. And I think it's quite beautiful that way as well.
That's something
that really, has a profundity underneath too. Yeah.
That's something I think about a lot, because there's so many moments where you're like, oh, are we supposed to love the boyfriend? Because there's so many places where you're like, I don't think we're supposed to love the boyfriend. And then like 2 sentences later, the narrator talks about how much you love the boyfriend. Which is very accurate to boyfriends in my experience with boyfriends.
Yeah, this book was originally titled Fuck, Marry, Kill Your Boyfriend.
Right.
Right, because you could do all three. And I think he retitled it because he like was worried that like maybe it was getting overlooked. Like, people were seeing that title and being like, ugh. So now it's Boy Oh Boy. But like, its first title for a long time was Fuck, Marry, Kill Your Boyfriend. And I think it's titled after a story in the collection.
Right, that game. Yeah.
Yeah, we played that game with like everyone we knew, right? Like, I'm sorry, like, as a part of him talking about the book, we're like, all right, let's. So. It's a good time.
Research.
So I'm thinking about, like, you talked about loss being something that comes up a lot in the book, and I wonder what other sort of themes and things we see repeated in the book as a whole, right? That the stories are doing both singularly and together, other than loss. Do you guys have any ideas?
Did somebody mention loneliness? I mean, all the stories are applying sort of all of the big themes, right? That familiar themes, loss and loneliness and grief and sorrow and dysfunction in relationships, and but it does it. Each story applies whatever the theme is in such a singular way that it never feels familiar to me, overly so, or like it's overly trod territory. It always feels fresh.
Yeah, I agree with that. And this book is so much about queer joy too, right? Zach was like really tired of like thinking about just queer suffering, right? And I think one thing that's really charming to me when we were like thinking about the cover and going back and forth over the cover, Zach's mom and I were like talking about it. And one thing that was really important to her is the figures on the front book. She like wanted their butts to be more prominent. She wanted them to be masculine. It was like really important to her that the book be read immediately as queer from the cover, which like to have like a mother in like Texas, right, to like feel that way. Like she's such an advocate for his work. Tasha, you were at AWP, right? And you saw Zach's mom. Can you talk a little about like her reading for him or being there for him at EWP?
Yeah, I mean, I think Zach is like one of the few people on this earth that just has like a really great mom. And she was like so supportive of Zach all the time. And I think one of the beautiful things that I really love about Zach's mom is that now she's become really supportive of all of the other writers that knew Zach. Because Zach had a lot of friends. Like he had a lot of friends both from grad school and his undergrad and in Houston, but he also had a lot of friends that he met online. So he had people everywhere that were really invested in him both as like a writer and through their friendship. And I think that she's like really shown support to all of these people. And she talks about how like wonderful like writers are to one another, which feels so refreshing, because a lot of the time like you think of writers and things get sort of catty, but it's like really nice to have like this like thing that draws all these people together that feels like very pure and kind. But so at AWP, we held a reading with some of Zach's friends, and Susan, Zach's mom, read, and she was so fantastic at reading. And it was a really beautiful and sad time, but she was really nervous to read, and she did a great job.
I heard that from everyone. I just can't imagine like your mother going to read for you at AWP. Like that's, to me, that's just so amazing. And she just wanted the book to do as well as it could, and she wanted to see it through, wants to see it through, right? Which I think is just, I don't know. I'm going to go ahead and read my excerpt now. I keep saying excerpt, but it's a story, right? It's an excerpt of the book. I'm going to read Godzilla. Your boyfriend decides to start a small business, and sure enough, the store he opens only comes up to your knee. Somehow he fits inside, but as much as you scrunch, you can't get in. Outside, on your hands and knees, you peek with one eye through the small windows. When you ask him who his intended customers are, he says, just really small people, I guess. Through the window, you see your boyfriend industriously filling wicker baskets with scented soaps, making neat rows of colorful bubble bath bottles. His shop is a disproportionately large success. Small people line up around the block for his honeysuckle-scented body lotion. He is interviewed by the local news. On television, he and his shop and the newscasters look like they're the correct size. This won't change anything about our relationship, your boyfriend says. You begin to fit uncomfortably into your own life. You ask coworkers, do I seem especially gigantic to you today? And while they assure you that you are normal size, they submit hostile work environment claims to the director of human resources. After an argument, you tell your boyfriend that you hate your job and you think you're about to get fired. I can support us both, he says. That isn't the point, you say. Every day, as you walk by your boyfriend's shop, you imagine crushing the mob of tiny people waiting their turn to fill their tiny baskets with tiny fancy bath products. The little dark smears on the sidewalk, the way they would make the bottom of your boots sticky, the puffs of honeysuckle or lilac or rose scent on the air as you crush their bath products. You imagine biting their tiny heads off, drinking from their bleeding necks. You are big enough and thirsty. I love this story. It does what so many of his stories do, where like it's so sad and humorous, right? Like I think everyone's maybe had the experience of not feeling like you fit into someone's life anymore, right? Whether like whatever kind of relationship that is. Like we outgrow and are outgrown by people all the time. So to see it literalized, which is what so many of the stories do, they take something that's really sad or something that happens and he like blows it up. It's like, here, can you see it, right? Like if I made it big enough to be seen. And in this case, right, like Godzilla, he's the narrator, right, is big. You're big and you don't fit anymore. So I really like this story a lot.
Well, while you were reading, I thought back to what you said about themes, and I think like cuteness is definitely a theme in the book. There's like a lot of cute objects and cute boyfriends, but I think cuteness is also weaponized.
Right.
Oh, I like that. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, I mean, like, so like the whole concept of a tiny store, like people love tiny things, right? And it just sounds so cute. But then he's like, wait a minute, like it's too tiny. I don't fit inside of this cuteness. Like this cuteness is alienating for me. Or like the trolls, like trolls aren't necessarily cute in the same way as tiny things, but they are small. They're like toys for children, but there are just so many of them that they become overwhelming. So I think throughout the book you have all of these like things that seem cute or innocuous, but they're not actually innocuous.
Yeah, there's also the story where they live in the tiny house together, right? And it's like overwhelming how they can't fit. So I think there's a lot about size, things being big or small.
Exactly. Yeah, fitting. You're thinking of bespoke too, right? Like there's just something about things that fit and things that don't fit, and both bodies, but also buildings, and yeah. That's such a great line. Let me just find it. You just read, this line. You begin to fit uncomfortably into your own life. Like that's just a line that sort of does itself even as it's going forward. Like it doesn't quite, it works because of the way it doesn't quite like follow its natural conventions. You begin to fit uncomfortably into your own life. That's just wonderful about something, that sense of like beginning to fit. And what is it? Can you fit uncomfortably? Is that possible? And yet, is that sort of how we often go through our lives, sort of, shoving things, like, so there is kind of a great liberation at the end of his kind of claiming of size and power, even though it's also scary and threatening. There's a shift that I think is really interesting.
Another thing that I love about that story is that it begins with a joke. I mean, there are a lot of jokes in Zach's stories and a lot of wordplay, and you could, if you wanted to, if you were that sort of reader and you wanted to sort of exist on the surface of these stories, there's incredible shimmer and flash to the surface of these stories. But then there's also this this fierce tenderness that wells up over the course of them, I think, that makes them all have a kind of emotional potency that capitalizes on the humor and the wordplay and the things that you might be inclined to see as these surface elements that don't take you very deep, but on the contrary.
I keep thinking about what Zach's reading would have been like were Zach to do it, and how different it is to have people doing it for him now. And it makes me think of a very particular reading. It was during AWP when it was in Los Angeles, and I was attending a reading that Zach was going to be reading at. And I got there 5 minutes late, and Zach had read first. It was the only reading in the history of the world that had ever started on time, or maybe early. And so I just spent the whole reading devastated because it became increasingly clear to me that he had already read. And so on the drive home, he read me the whole thing in the car. And it's the best reading I ever went to because he wasn't mean that I had missed it. He was so kind and just read it for me again. And he's such a great reader of his own work. And I could really hear his voice in the the pacing of the jokes, right? They are biting. I think Zach could be brutal in the best way, right? He was very incisive in that way. And I think this book gets at that.
I like to think that if Zach had his perfect reading, it would be at a club, and there would be lots of people wearing very shiny things, and also a lot of very attractive men who just like showed up, like they were excited about the book and they came to the reading to like offer themselves up as boyfriends. And I think there'd also be like a nice array of tiny snacks and definitely little alcoholic minis, because Zach really liked the little alcoholic minis.
It's beautiful.
I love that so much. So much went into this book, and I like really regret that Zach couldn't be like a part of the editorial process for it. And I wanted to make sure I remembered to thank a couple of people. So Emily Gamender really helped with some edits, with helping me decide, like, was this an aesthetic choice or is this like a mistake, right? Like, is this a typo? There's things like, you know, for yourself immediately, but trying to make those guesses for someone else is really hard. Brian Olu was really helpful in advice on the cover. Of course, like Susan Doss, like, was just there for every step. Jonathan Wardowski was really helpful for some stuff. So I just wanted to make sure that I thanked them before we like kept going. I meant to do it at the start.
Brandi, could you talk a little bit about your experience with the editorial process? I would love to hear.
Yeah, Red Hen was so great and so kind all the way. I feel like we went back and forth on the cover like so many times. It must have been like at least slightly annoying. You're like, can you add more cats? Can you make the butts more butt-like? Those kinds of asks are maybe a little silly, but like felt important. We didn't do much to it other than like correct like a couple of typos. I just wonder how painstaking it would have been for Zach, because I saw like the work he put into like ordering it and the way he kept making all these big changes last minute, like adding a story or like the section headings. I love the section headings in this, right? The stories are grouped by section. It's your boyfriend always has something he wants to do. And then the section is, and then he asks, what would you do differently? Section 3 is, I'm having a very authentic experience, you think. And 4, you love it all so goddamn much. And then you did the things that made sense to you. And then the game begins to occupy a very central place in your life. And then boyfriends all the way down. And then the last section that only has the village with all the boyfriends in it is, you're waiting for a foundation to crack. And a lot of these are pulled from stories specifically, which is like a title move that I like too, right? But that wasn't something like, that was like a later thing where he like put them in sections and like grouped them. And he just had several other writers that he really admired that did that. I know that he was always a big fan of Kellie Link. It's so exciting that she chose the book, right? Like, that's why he submitted.
Can we talk about his process in trying to get it published? Because that was like a journey.
He sent it to so many places. It was like rejected and rejected and rejected, and he just thought it wasn't going to happen. So I put all these notes up around our apartment. Like I like hid them in things and put them on the fridge and like put them in his medicine cabinet that are like, you're doing a great job, or like, you're doing good. That like were just everywhere. And I thought he would take them down, but he just left them all. So our apartment was just covered in notes for months. And people would come over and we'd have to explain why they were like notes on the salt shaker and notes on the fridge, notes on the pickles. But yeah, he just didn't think it was going to happen. And he never did know that it happened. Not in that way. But Kellie Link choosing it was such a big deal for him. Like he like submitted, I think he was like near the end of his rope, and he only submitted because he loves her writing so much. He's such a big fan. I feel like she was formative for him. So then to have her pick it is just such validation, right? Like the validation that like he needed. Like, I don't know. Do you remember anything from that time, from him talking about submitting?
I just remember I think it's one of the difficult things if you are someone who writes humorous things. Like, people like to read humorous things, and then I feel like there's like a disconnect in the publishing process where people want to publish like the very serious book about like life and death, and like this book has that stuff in it, but it's portrayed in a serious way. And so I think that one of his insecurities about the book was that it just like wasn't serious enough. Like he wasn't doing what serious writers are supposed to do, and like maybe that's why it wasn't getting published. And then he like changed the title, and then it was supposed to have like he wanted a Carly Rae Jepsen epigraph that he couldn't include. So like I think everyone thought that it was going to get published eventually. Like I think Zach was the only person who didn't believe that it was going to be published. And I thought it would be published immediately, just because everyone, like even from like the very beginning, everyone loved these stories so much that it was a surprise to me that it took a while.
Yeah, I think one of the things he worried about was that the stories, he worried that maybe they didn't accumulate, right? Like I remember him worried that like maybe people liked one or two of them, but like when you stack them all together, he was worried that like the parts like were more than the whole. But I think that's not the case. I think they like all really do something interesting together, right? Like there's like some work being done by laying them together that way. That's more than just reading one or two along.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Yeah.
Aimee, I wanted to ask you, and you might not remember because it's been a minute, but I know he was working on new things, right? Like, because he was beyond writing this book, really. He was working on a novel and then maybe some stories for class. And I just wondered if you remember if the concerns he had or the interests he had were the same or different. It felt like he was thinking about different things or going in a different direction, or like where his head was with writing.
Yeah, I was actually thinking about that myself because I was doing this independent study with him in the semester when he died, and he was working on a novel, so he was bringing in pages of his novel, which does still feel really clear in my mind, actually, about two young men who were it sort of was like it was both it had like a combination of so many elements where there was kind of a broken old theme park, but they were there, and were they being hunted or not hunted, and were they cyborgs or were they human, or like there were all these elements together, and it was really setting was actually important in a way that I think felt different, and really vast and sort of beautiful and stark, and about, again, love and relationships, but also about kind of it was a larger cast because there were quite a few characters and varying sort of beliefs on levels of humanity and who's hunting whom and who's safe and who's not safe. And so it felt like it had echoes in sci-fi and in The Island of Dr. Moreau and all this stuff. And it was really a juicy, wonderful thing. And it was also really at its beginning. So, the pages exist somewhere. But I feel a certain, honor about having gotten to see those pages. I feel a little bit like I got to be the keeper of the early stages of something that wouldn't be able to be finished. And yeah, I feel a kind of certain responsibility to just hold it in my memory.
Yeah.
And it feels good to talk about it, actually, so people can have their own sort of imaginative filling in, even with the skeletal elements of it, to start to fill that in and put Zach's voice to it. And there's something, and I think somehow this feels important to say, because there's something about what Kellie was saying about the work in Boy Oh Boy too, feeling like it had such a naturalness and joy in the process that he didn't even quite trust it. But I think work like that often invites writers to write. There is a contagious joy in the process that you feel. You feel that ease and delight. And so I think, Zach was such a supporter of writers, and he was a writer, and he was so involved in the literary community. So I think, I don't know. I think it's a book that you read and you revel in as a reader. And I think it makes a writer want to go try some stuff out. And I think, that feels like an important legacy in the book as well, and in him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like you can tell when someone's having fun, and you could see like some of the fun on the page for Zach, right? Like you could tell when he charmed himself a little, which is like a thing I really love.
And then the meaning and the depth sneaks up because it's like it will be there, like it is in our experience and in our in our words, but he wasn't pushing or forcing it.
I agree that it's that kind of book that I would pick up to read in order to spark my own interest in writing and doing something.
Yeah. Is there anything we didn't talk about, some story or aspect of the book that we wanted to mention? I feel like we skated around a lot. Yeah. It was really lovely to have a conversation with all of you about Zach. I was a little nervous, but I feel like it's my favorite thing to do is to talk about Zach and Zach's writing. And so much of Zach I think about through his writing. I feel like one of the first times we met, he was still a poet. He read poems aloud to me that he had written because he was so excited about them. And to be someone that could get so excited about your writing that you want to read it to a new friend, I don't know, like it was so intricate in the way I understood and thought about Zach, right? Like he was my friend and he was also a writer, and those things were just really laced together for me.
Mm.
Anyway, I want to thank everyone for watching, and thank all of you for participating, and thank Red Hen for everything. They've been so wonderful to work with.
Thank you, Brandi.
Thank you. Thank you all.